Dr. Michael Brown.
Welcome back to The Line of Fire, 866-34-TRUTH. I'm speaking with Joshua, and Joshua has an interesting proposal about marriage, an interesting proposal about biblical marriage versus secular marriage, even in light of American history. As I was mentioning, we met at a conference some months back. Joshua told me about what he had written. I was skeptical. I had questions because I felt that this could be some type of capitulation to gay activism or cultural changes or things like that. And he began to discuss the history of America with me. So we're going to have a discussion about this on the air. Joshua, thanks for joining us on The Line of Fire today.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, Joshua, tell us what you've written and give us the overview. We'll dig into it. I'll ask my skeptical questions, some based on knowledge, some based on not having studied certain things in our history. But give me the overall thesis, the name of what you've written, the overall thesis.
Okay. Thank you. And the title of the book is The Biblical Marriage for God or Government. And the premise and the idea behind it is basically, I don't think that it's in Christians' best interest to get a marriage license based on biblical reasoning as well as just legal reasoning.
All right, so let's first start with your biblical reasoning, then we'll go legally. And the thing that most fascinated me, Joshua, was when you talked about American history and how marriage was looked at in American history. And that's the thing I've really studied the least, to be honest. I've studied different aspects of American history, but never that. So first give me your biblical argument, then your legal argument, then let's talk history.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you, Dr. Brown. The biblical argument is I was meditating on Matthew 22, I believe it is, where Jesus is with the Pharisees, and they're talking about giving to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's. And so Jesus broadens the scope of the conversation away from just taxes. There's more to it than that. And so I was pondering, what do I want to give to God? And in the process, over time, I thought, I want to give my marriage to God. And if we have freedom of religion in our country, then I don't understand why there's a license. And so from that point, I began to look into the license and what that actually meant and what that actually represented. And so when I delved into the United States history, the marriage license first came about in 1800, and it was in North Carolina and Tennessee that it was established for blacks and whites to get a marriage license because it was illegal at the time for blacks and whites to be married. And so they came up with a license. And so from there, it developed in our country to where in 1909, there was a meeting with several of the states where they got together and they said, you know what, we want to expressly get together and abolish the idea of common law marriage. Now, up until this point, Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, none of them had the marriage license. And so the states got together, and by 1929, they made it so all the states had the Marriage License Act, which was established at that point. And then one of the things that I looked into also was the fact that the U.S. Supreme Court earlier than 1929, 1877, Meister versus Moore, ruled that you can't force people to, in fact, sign the marriage license. It's more voluntary, or directory is the legal term they use.
All right, so let's just talk practically for a moment before we go back in history. When Nancy and I got married in 1976, all that we were thinking about was joining our lives together for the rest of our lives in the sight of God. That was the issue. And then something I just had to sign. Now you're done, sign this, and whatever, the pastor signed it, and okay, now we're done. We're official. But on a practical level, there were issues, be it tax returns, be it if we were sending our kids to a Christian school, we were the parents, be it checking into a hotel together, and, we're husband and wife, because there are places that, if you weren't married, they wouldn't let you share a room, in times past here in the States. So there are just lots of practical things. I didn't really think about it, but the more you do think about it, there are tons of laws that apply to married people, or benefits that you have, or whatever, or things for your children. So how do we just ignore all that now? Let's just say that your recounting of the history is accurate. Then how do we get away from what's the law of the land and hundreds of different things that intersect with the secular aspects of the fact that we have an official marriage license?
Great question, Dr. Brown. Thank you. I looked into some of these things, and I wondered the same thing. Like, if I get married without a marriage license, am I still going to be able to file taxes together? Great question. Are there additional benefits for having a marriage license that wouldn't be available otherwise without a marriage license? And so as I did my research and I investigated these things and actually talked with other Christians who didn't sign the marriage license, in my book I speak with a lady named Trish, and I asked her story, and they were convicted about the marriage license and didn't sign it, and proceeded to, she changed her name. None of the elements that kind of rise up in those questions were an issue. They filed taxes together. She changed her name, custody and children, and all of these things that were questions weren't even an issue. Basically, they had a legal marriage, and they proceeded to live that life without the marriage license.
All right, and how did they demonstrate that they had a legal marriage?
So what they did was she just assumed his name. She changed her social security number or card, and then they obviously had a family together, lived together, and held themselves out to be married. They had a marriage ceremony. And if you are interested in not having the marriage license, all that is taking place is there's just a relationship change. And so when you go to the court, you need to simply prove your marriage. And so there are key elements that add up to where the court will say, obviously these people are married. They live together. They've had a wedding ceremony. There's wedding pictures, and there was.
Well, what if you didn't have? What if you didn't have wedding pictures? What if you didn't document it? What if it was just, you just wanted to make this sacred between you and God? So the pastor came over to your house and did the ceremony, and you had, best man and maid of honor witnessed it, but you didn't take pictures. You just wanted this to be between you and God, or you didn't have the capability of taking pictures that day. And
sure.
So if there's no documentation, you're still saying that you've got to prove something to the world. So I don't know why that's any. And I'm not being adversarial. I'm just trying to probe here.
Sure.
It still doesn't tell me that there's any real reason not to just have a secular license. I mean, it hasn't affected me in any way, hasn't hurt me, hasn't dragged me down. I haven't had a compromise over it. So why should we withdraw in that respect?
So by definition, a license means the ability to do something which would otherwise be illegal. And so what we're doing in a sense as Christians is we're admitting like a man and a woman to get married is illegal when we sign that document. And what God said was good isn't, and it's actually a criminal offense. But thankfully we went to the state, and thankfully they gave us permission to get married, and now we're in a three-way contract or covenant between husband, spouse, wife, and the state.
But isn't it really the opposite of that the state is obligated to recognize the marriage? That all you have to do is go through the ceremony, and as long as the person is ordained or is has the authority to do it, which gives some protection, otherwise just get some homeless guy on the street and say, hey, pronounce us married, so there should be some authority or some accountability with it. But you can be ordained, you can have a church of 4 people and ordain somebody, and then that person can marry. I mean, you don't have to jump through all kinds of hoops. But the state is now obligated. The state can't say, well, we don't like that church, or Jehovah's Witnesses, that's a cult, or you don't have enough people in the denomination. No, it's just an automatic that you're now registered. So isn't the state now subservient to whatever the church does? And you don't need a justice of the peace because you have the authority to do it?
So what is it that you're specifically getting at? Because it seems like,
in other words, there's no reason to not do it. It's practical.
There's no reason to not get a marriage license.
In other words, there's no reason not to, because I don't need the state's recognition to say I'm married, but for practical purposes, because I live here, just like I have a social security number, I live here, certain things, so it's by way of identification. Tell you what, we got a break. We'll do the answer on the other side. Thanks.
Sure.
It's The Line of Fire with your host, Dr. Michael Brown. Get into the Line of Fire now by calling 866-34-TRUTH. Here again is Dr. Michael Brown.
I'm speaking with Joshua, who's written the book, Biblical Marriage, and his point is that we should not even get involved with civil marriage, with secular marriage, that we get married before God, and that we just document it, and if the courts question it because we don't sign a marriage license, we say, well, we went through the name change anyway, and the wife did, and here's the documentation of the wedding, and that's sufficient. So, Joshua, just a larger question. Do you have an ideological view of how the church should relate to government, or are you libertarian in your thinking? Where do you come down on that?
Well, I'm a fan of the Constitution, and I think that believers should follow the Constitution and the way in which this nation was structured. And being that, one, the government has, in the Bill of Rights, indicated that we have freedom of religion, so basically the authority of the Bible is where followers of Jesus come from in terms of how they proceed and honor the authority of the land, because the Constitution is the highest authority. The president is supposed to be subject to it, the senators, governors. And so I'm all for obeying the laws as it pertains to what this country was set up upon.
All right, and how do you feel it would help believers to not get marriage licenses? And so, again, you're just talking about a ceremony in a church. You can document it in the church or whatever congregation you're part of, or your house group, and that's the extent of it. What's the advantage in your eyes?
So the question for me was, is the government holy? And should we be covenanting with the state, in this case, in our marriages? And what does the Bible say, and what does the law of the land say? It was interesting to note that I discovered that on Ohio's website, that they say that marriage is a legal, spiritual, and personal relationship. And the spiritual element really stuck out to me because I thought, well, God is not mentioned anywhere in the terms and conditions. He's left out completely. And if atheists and agnostics are getting married in Ohio, they don't even believe that there's a God. So then where is the spiritual element coming in? And so as I looked into this further, it kind of seems that the state is setting itself up as God and parent to give permission to do something which God has always said is good and holy. And so being now that the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that homosexuals can get a marriage license, the government doesn't even know what the definition truly is for marriage. Mm-hmm. And so why, as Christians, are we going to come into agreement with this unholy, ungodly body of law where we can be set apart, which is the message, I believe, through Genesis to Revelation. Mm-hmm. Abraham left his homeland, and in Revelation he says, come out from Babylon and be set apart to me. And so I just have a heart for marriage. There's something clearly wrong, in our Christian community, because divorce is so high. And so is this an attachment? Is this like in Deuteronomy 7 where we're covenanting with the nations around us? And it says in verse 3, not to marry in with them. And
right, but that's intermarrying. But I mean, let's be honest there. That's talking about Israelites intermarrying with Canaanites. It's not talking about a government recognizing marriage. And let's also be honest that we had marriage licenses quite a while before we had this divorce explosion. So you've got to look deeper than that. I can understand if you say, hey, the government doesn't give us a recognition of our baptism. That's not their role. And marriage is a sacred ceremony, and that we don't need the government recognition. I understand that. Again, for me, there's and I had you on the air to talk about it. I thought, okay, interesting. Let's discuss it. To me, though, look, the fact that people can marry in all kinds of marriages that are sinful in God's sight, that doesn't mean anything. In other words, someone can be divorced 7 times and no grounds for the divorce and marry again. They can do that under the state. So we've just further messed up marriage with our current redefinition. But let me just play a clip for you, and we'll interact based on this. This goes back a few years. It's July 10th, 2013, Gay USA, with Ann Northrup and Andy Hum. It's a LGBT news show, and they're speaking with James Essex, the director of the ACLU Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, and AIDS Project. Clip number 5.
These religious freedom arguments, these religious exemption arguments, are so powerful because they could completely eviscerate the non-discrimination norms that we have already passed in states and that we are trying to pass in at the federal government level and in other states as well. And so these are not places where it makes sense for us to compromise as a community, because it's going to completely undermine the quality principles that we need.
All right, so Joshua, here's the question. Gay activists there were saying that if we have religious freedoms protections, right? If we have, for example, the bakers do not have to bake a cake. They do not have to bake a cake for a gay couple any more than they would have to bake a cake for atheists who wanted to say, put on the cake, there is no God. They're free not to do that because of their religious beliefs. That this would completely eviscerate all of the gay activist advances. Couldn't the argument be made that if Christians now just say, okay, we've got nothing to do with civil marriage, we've got nothing to do with marriage as it intersects with the state, that now it's a complete withdrawal? Rather than being salt and light in the society, it's a complete withdrawal and a complete capitulation. That's obviously been a concern. Now, again, you're coming at it from a different angle, which I respect. But when some say just pull out, to me, no, we're supposed to make a difference and bring positive influence and change, as opposed to let society collapse on its own. So you get the last word in.
Thank you. That's a great point, great question. I look at it differently. Is God has called his people to be in the world, but not of it. We don't need to go and beg for permission to do something that isn't criminal, because we can clearly get married, and we can be salt and light by being following the Bible and its example, because there's no need to be connected to the state. The belief is that our marriages will be thriving, that there is life in them, because we're going back towards the Bible. We're not going along with the world and being unequally yoked, in a sense, to what's going on.
Yep. All right. I understand that. And again, from my perspective, I never once thought of bending to the world or bowing to the world or being yoked with the world by just something being recognized. But I appreciate the perspective of the book, Biblical Marriage. Hey, Josh, thanks for coming on and discussing it. And I will. You do have me thinking about American history. I'm definitely going to look back in our history. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. Have a wonderful day.
All right, you too. Hey, friends, just